Hello everyone, my name is Babar Majid. I'm a software engineer. In this short lecture series, I will walk you through the process of creating SIGN request to API gateway. The technologies which I will use are TypeScript, Node.js, Angular framework, serverless framework, AWS Lambda, and AWS API gateway. At the end of this lecture series, you would be able to answer the following questions: how to create SIGN request to API gateway, how to create lambdas in AWS console, how to create APIs using AWS API gateway console, how to create lambdas using serverless framework, how to deploy an API using serverless, and how to create a basic Angular application. So let's start learning. I will start by discussing the theory behind Amazon API Gateway SIGN request. Then I'll go to the AWS console and create APIs and lambdas and give demos of different kind of services. So let's start. So this is the content which I will discuss in this lecture series. So I'll start with the API Gateway SIGN request. I'll give a brief introduction, and then I'll give different kind of steps how to generate the signed API Gateway requests. Then I'll discuss the architecture of services which I will use in my demo, and I'll give a brief description of the application and the workflow which would be used for the SIGN API requests. Then I'll go to AWS Lambda console and create Lambda functions. Then after that, I'll go to API Gateway console, and then I'll create APIs there, and then I'll integrate Lambda functions with those APIs. Furthermore, I'll demonstrate SIGN request in Postman. Then I'll use a front-end Angular application to demonstrate the SIGN request. So here in this step, I will create the Angular application, and then for creation of the authorization header, I will use TypeScript, Node.js, and then I will use a serverless framework to deploy that API into AWS. Then I'll demonstrate the SIGN request in Angular application. So what are the API Gateway SIGN requests? So whenever you send a request to API Gateway, you basically sign the request so that AWS can identify who has sent this request. So for the identification, you actually create a digital signature of this request using the secret key and the access key, and then that digital signature is part of the header of the request, and then you send it to API Gateway. So let's understand this using this example. For example, here we have an application, and we want to hit the API Gateway and retrieve some item from that. So whenever we send this request, so we want to sign this request. So that means like we want to create a digital signature of this request. So this digital signature would be created using the secret key, the access key, this method, and some of the parameter from the URL, that is like canonical URI, canonical query parameters, host name, and Amazon date. There is a specific format of that. So then you create a hash using some cryptographic function, and then you add that hash into the authorization header of this request, and then you send this request to API Gateway. Once API Gateway receives that request, so it recalculates that hash and then compare the hash which is sent in the authorization header. If both are same, then the request is accepted, otherwise it is rejected. I hope it will not too much confusing. If it is, so don't worry, I will explain it again and again. So the AWS documentation has divided the sign request into different steps. So I'll go over different steps. So here are these steps. So first is to create a canonical request, then create a string to sign, then calculate the signature, and finally add the authorization header to the request. So let's go to each step in the next slides. So in the first step, the creation of the canonical request. So basically, whenever an HTTP request is sent to API gateway, this is something like that. So it has a method, then it has a URL that has a host name, and then the query parameters, then header, and like different kind of headers. So if we want to convert it to the canonical request, so how would we do that? So in the AWS documentation, they have given some pseudocode. So the canonical request, basically that is equal to HTTP request method, that is in this case the get one, and then the next line, and then canonical URI. The canonical URI is basically the part after .com and before this question mark. So if there is any path there, so we add it here in the canonical URI. In this case, it is empty, so but we will use the / over here. And the canonical query string is basically everything after the canonical URI, that is starting from action until over here. So the canonical headers, those are all the headers which are included in the request. So in this case, those are host, content type, and X Amazon date. And the sign headers are basically the strings of the titles, like the host, content type, and X Amazon date, but in the lower cases, and those are separated by semicolons. And at the end, the hash is created of the payload. If any payload is included in the request, then we create a hash using some cryptographic hash function. And this is the example canonical request. So here we have this method name get, then this one is the canonical URI, this one is a canonical query string, this is canonical headers, and this one is the sign headers, and this one is hash. And finally, we create the hash of whole of the canonical request using the hash function, which would be used in the next step. So the second step is create a string to sign. So this is the pseudocode for string to sign that will use the algorithm, the request date and time, credential scope, and the hash canonical request, which is basically created in the previous step. So here is the example. So the algorithm is AWS4 HMAC SHA-256 in this case. The request date and time is in this format, and the credential scope, it has a date, region, service name, and AWS4 request, which is the basically signature version 4. And then at the end, the hash canonical request, which is created in the previous step. So the next step is calculate the signature. For calculating the signature, we create the hash of different parameters. So we will start from the secret key, and then using the secret key we calculate the date, then using both of date and secret key we calculate the region, then we calculate service using all of the above, and at the end we calculate signing using the K service, region, and date and secret. And finally, for signature, we use this string to sign and a derived signing key. So, and finally we get this hash for the signature. And in the fourth step, we add all of the above information in the authorization header. So this is the pseudocode for that. So authorization, here we add the algorithm name, then in the credential we use the access key ID, then the credential scope, and the sign header, we use all of the sign headers, and at the end we add the signature over here, which we calculated in the previous step. So this is the example of the authorization header. So it has this algorithm, AWS4 HMAC SHA-256 for the credential access key ID, and then for the credential scope, date, the region, service name, AWS4 request, and then for the sign headers, like all of the header titles in small cases separated using the semicolon, and at the end signature is added there. So in the next slide, I will discuss the architecture of this application that I would use for API gateway sign requests. So I will use the Angular application on the front end that basically will call the API gateway. It will send the HTTP requests, and the API gateway is integrated with two Lambda functions. Both are written in Node.js. So there would be one GET request that will interact with the GET item Lambda function, and there is another request that would be the POST request that will integrate with the save item Lambda function. So whenever we call the GET item, so first there would be another API, so that would be the authorization API, and the Angular application will call that API and then get the header using another Lambda function. So then whenever this authorization header is returned, then this authorization header is used as a header of this get item request, and the same thing is done with this save item.